Philadelphia, 1727. The city is asleep, the taverns have closed. The last lamp in most windows went dark an hour ago. But in a narrow building on a street most people walk past without noticing, there is light. A young man is at a printing press. He is 21 years old. He has no business of his own, no family money, no patron with reliable promises. His clothes are plain. His hands are ink-stained. The city does not know his name yet, not in any way that matters. He is not working because someone told him to. The shop belongs to a man named Samuel Keimer, who is not here tonight. Keimer sleeps while this young man works. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And the young man knows it. This is where the story, not with a discovery or a speech or a founding document, with a press, a candle, and a choice that nobody is watching him make. His name is Benjamin Franklin. There is a version of this story that most people already know. Franklin the kite flyer, Franklin the statesman, Franklin the face on a banknote. Those versions are not wrong, but they begin far too late. They begin after the outcome is already visible, and they work backward to explain it. That is the least honest way to understand any person. The honest version begins here, in the dark, in a borrowed shop, in a city that has already tried more than once to send this young man back to where he came from. To understand what he is doing at that press and why it matters, you have to understand what had already been done to stop him. Franklin was born in Boston in January of 1706, the 15th of 17 children. His father, Josiah, was a candle and soap maker. Not a failed businessman, not a man of reduced circumstances, a working tradesman who had always been a working tradesman, as had his father and the generation. Franklin would later write that his family had lived in the same English village for at least 300 years, surviving on a small freehold of about 30 acres, supplementing it with a trade of blacksmith passed from eldest son to eldest son. They were not poor in a desperate sense. They were simply not a family that had ever accumulated anything beyond what the next season required. In that household, formal education was a luxury that lasted exactly 2 years. Franklin entered the Boston Latin School at 8 years old. His father pulled him out at 10. There was work to be done, and Benjamin was old enough to do it. He spent the next 2 years in the candle shop, cutting wicks and filling moulds, learning what it felt like to do the same task with his hands every single day with no particular future attached to it. He hated it. Not in a dramatic way, he simply understood with the quiet certainty of a child who reads everything he can find that this was not what his mind was built for. He told his father as much. His father listened, and to Josiah Franklin's credit, he paid attention. He took his son around Boston to watch other tradesmen at work, masons, coopers, joiners, braziers, looking for something that might hold the boy's attention long enough to keep him from running off to sea as another of his sons had already done. What held Benjamin's attention was a printing house. His older brother James had returned from England in 1717 with a press and a set of types. The work involved language, ideas, and the physical act of arranging them into something permanent. For a boy who was already spending every spare coin on books and reading them through the night. This was the closest thing to a natural fit that a tradesman's life could offer. At 12 years old, Franklin signed an indenture, 9 years of apprenticeship to James, journeyman wages only in the final year. Everything else, his time, his labour, his choices about where to go and when, belonged to his brother by legal contract. James Franklin was not a gentle employer. Franklin describes him plainly as passionate and prone to blows. The physical punishments were real, so was the more corrosive daily reality of being legally subordinate to a man who was also your brother, who knew you well enough to know exactly which kind of authority would sting most. Franklin was not allowed to simply be good at the work. He had to be good at the work while also performing deference he did not feel. He managed it for several years. More than that, he quietly made himself indispensable. He learnt the trade faster than anyone expected. He read everything that came through the shop. He began to write, first in secret, sliding anonymous essays under the door of the New England Courant, the newspaper James was publishing. James printed them. The readership responded to them. James had no idea who was writing them. When he found out, he was not pleased. The relationship deteriorated steadily after that. When James was briefly jailed by the colonial authorities for printing material that irritated the governor, the management of the newspaper fell temporarily to Benjamin. He was, for a short period, the one making decisions. Then James came back, and Benjamin was the apprentice again. The break came when Benjamin was 17. The specific quarrel is less important than the structure of what he did. James had, at an earlier point, formally released Benjamin from his original indenture as a legal manoeuvre, a way of protecting the newspaper from assembly oversight. Benjamin had signed a new secret contract to replace it when the relationship became unbearable. Benjamin chose to treat the public discharge as real and the secret contract as void. He walked out. He later called this dishonourable. He said so plainly without excusing himself. The secret contract was a real obligation, and he knew it when he used the legal loophole to escape it. He wrote it down as one of the first errors of his life, not because he regretted leaving, but because he understood that the method mattered, and that a man who would exploit a technicality to break a commitment had to reckon with what that said about him. James went to every printing house in Boston and warned them against hiring his brother. Every one of them turned Benjamin away. He had no work, no references, and a reputation as a runaway. Boston was finished with him before he had ever really started. He boarded a boat to New York. New York had nothing for him either. He walked south. He eventually reached Philadelphia on a Sunday morning in October of 1723, tired, hungry, and carrying almost nothing. He bought 3 large bread rolls because they were cheap and he could carry them. A woman named Miss Reed watched him from her doorway, eating his roll and wandering the street. He looked, by his own account, ridiculous. He noticed her noticing him. He would later marry her. Boston was not a city that forgave people for being born into the wrong family. It had its hierarchies, and those hierarchies had weight. The merchant class sat above the tradesmen. The educated sat above the unlettered. The established church sat above everyone who questioned it, and at the bottom of all of it, largely invisible to the people who wrote history at the time, were the families who made things with their hands and counted themselves fortunate if they finished each year without debt. Josiah Franklin was one of those men. He had emigrated from Northamptonshire in England sometime around 1680, bringing with him a trade, a Protestant faith, and no illusions about what kind of life awaited a working man in the colonies. He was a tallow chandler, a maker of candles and soap. It was not a prestigious occupation. It was not meant to be. It was steady work that served a real need, and in a colonial city that required both light and cleanliness, it kept a family fed. What it could not do was provide the kind of upward mobility that required capital to begin with. The Franklins were not a family on the way up. They were a family holding position, generation after generation of skilled hands doing skilled work, accumulating enough to survive, but rarely enough to change the conditions of their survival. Franklin's own research into his family history, conducted during a visit to England decades later, turned up records stretching back 300 years to a small village where the same family had worked the same land and the same trades across generation after generation. The name Franklin itself had once been a common term for a class of freehold farmers, people of modest property and no title. Even the family name was a description of social rank, and that rank had never changed. Into this world, Benjamin Franklin arrived in January 1706, the 15th of 17 children. That number needs to sit for a moment. 17. Josiah Franklin had been married twice. His first wife died young, and he remarried, and between the two unions he fathered children at a rate that was extraordinary even by the standards of the era. The household that Benjamin grew up in was not intimate. It was managed. Resources were allocated, responsibilities assigned, expectations set. There was not enough parental attention to go around, and Franklin understood this without bitterness. He simply absorbed it as one of the facts of the world he had been placed in. What Josiah Franklin did possess beyond his trade and his faith was genuine intellectual curiosity. Franklin describes his father as a man who could draw people into conversation, who had a talent for resolving disputes, who read and thought seriously about questions of practical morality. Prominent citizens of Boston would seek him out for his judgment on difficult matters. He had no formal authority and no institutional standing. What he had was a reputation for clear thinking, honestly applied. Franklin would inherit this quality so completely that it would become impossible, reading his later life, to tell where the father's influence ended and the son's own nature began. But Josiah was also a realist. He had 10 children to feed and a tallow shop to run, and he knew the difference between admiring a quality in his son and being able to afford to cultivate it. Franklin was sent to Boston Latin School at 8 years old. He performed well. The expectation, briefly, was that he might be educated for the clergy, one of the few paths by which a man of no property could acquire genuine social elevation. But the cost of that education, spread across a family of this size, was simply beyond what the candle shop could support. After 2 years, Franklin was home again. He was 10 years old. His formal education was finished. This is not a metaphor or an exaggeration. He never attended another school. Everything that followed, every idea he developed, every book he mastered, every skill he acquired, came through his own effort outside any institutional framework. He did not have the education that circumstances should have provided. He built a substitute from whatever materials came within reach. The materials were limited at first. His father's library was primarily theological, books of practical and polemical religion, the kind of reading that shaped colonial Protestant households. Franklin worked through most of them, though he recalled later wishing that better books had been available to him during those years of acute intellectual hunger. He found Plutarch's Lives among his father's collection and read it with sustained attention. The biographies of Greek and Roman figures who had shaped history through force of character and civic engagement. He found an essay by Daniel Defoe on projects and improvement, and something in its tone, practical, forward-looking, uninterested in rank for its own sake, left an impression that took years to fully surface. He spent every coin he could spare on books. He sold one collection to buy another. He borrowed from anyone willing to lend and returned volumes carefully and on time, because he understood that a reputation for reliability was worth more than any single book. A tradesman named Matthew Adams, who frequented the printing house after Franklin joined it, noticed the young apprentice's hunger and opened his private library to him without charge. Franklin read late into the night, finishing borrowed books before morning because they had to be returned the next day. This is worth understanding precisely because it sits so far outside how we typically explain exceptional people. We reach for words like gifted or brilliant, and sometimes those words are accurate enough, but what they tend to obscure is the sheer mechanical volume of effort behind the result. Franklin was not educated. He was relentlessly self-educated, which is an entirely different thing. Self-education has no syllabus and no examinations. It has no one telling you what matters and what doesn't. It requires a person to make those judgments independently, often without enough context to make them well, and to keep going anyway. He developed his writing through a method that was equally deliberate. He discovered the Spectator, the early 18th century English journal of Joseph Addison and Richard Steele, and recognised immediately that its prose was a model worth pursuing. He read the essays. He took notes on their arguments. Then he put the originals away and rewrote them from his own notes, trying to reconstruct not the specific sentences, but the logic and the shape. Then he compared what he had written against the original and corrected himself. He did this repeatedly, not because anyone asked him to, but because he had identified the gap between where his writing was and where he needed it to be, and he designed a training regimen to close that gap. There is a particular kind of authority that is harder to resist than outright tyranny. Outright tyranny gives you something clear to push against. What James Franklin exercised over his younger brother was more complicated than that. It was the authority of contract, of family obligation, and of physical proximity, all operating at once, in a space small enough that there was nowhere to go when any one of them became unbearable. Franklin entered the printing house at 12 years old, knowing, on some level, that he was trading one form of confinement for another. The candle shop had been tedious and physically limiting. The printing house was neither of those things. It engaged his mind, gave him access to books and ideas, and placed him inside the actual production of language. By any measure available to a boy of his circumstances, it was the better arrangement. He signed the indenture. 9 years of service to James. He would have known, doing the arithmetic, that he would be 21 before he was legally free. What he could not have fully calculated was what 9 years inside a relationship with James would cost him in ways that had nothing to do with money or time. James Franklin was not an unintelligent man. He had trained in London, returned to Boston with proper equipment, and built a functioning print shop capable of producing a newspaper, the New England Courant, launched in 1721, that was genuinely willing to irritate the colonial establishment. The Courant mocked the governor. It questioned the prevailing medical consensus on smallpox inoculation at a moment when that question carried real social risk. It printed what other Boston papers would not. In this sense, James had a kind of editorial courage that deserves acknowledgement. But courage in print did not translate into fairness in person. The physical punishments Franklin describes are recorded flatly, without theatrical anguish. James hit him more than once over the course of the apprenticeship. Franklin does not linger on this. He states it as a fact about the environment he was working in, the way a man might note that a particular workshop had poor ventilation. It was a condition of the arrangement, and he adapted to it as he adapted to everything else. What wore on him more persistently was the daily structure of subordination. Franklin was becoming, visibly and undeniably, better at the work than his employer. His speed at composition, his instinct for language, his ability to manage the physical operation of the press, all of it exceeded what James could offer. This is not an uncommon dynamic in apprenticeships, but it is almost always an uncomfortable one. The apprentice's growing competence is implicitly a running commentary on the master's limitations. James was not the kind of man who received that commentary with grace. The writing made it worse. Franklin had begun submitting essays to the Courant anonymously, folding the papers and sliding them under the door at night, disguising his handwriting. He called himself Silence Dogged, a widow with opinions about Boston society, religion, education, and the pretensions of the learned class. The persona was a deliberate invention, down to her backstory and her rhetorical habits, and it worked. James and his colleagues at the paper read the Dogood letters aloud, praised them, tried to guess who had written them, and concluded it must be someone of standing and experience. The author was their 16-year-old apprentice. When the authorship was revealed, James was not charmed. The praise his colleagues had heaped on those letters now attached itself to Benjamin rather than to the paper James ran, and that was not an outcome James could accept with equanimity. The dynamic between them, already strained, shifted into something harder. Franklin had demonstrated publicly, among the small circle of men whose opinions mattered in that print shop, that his judgment and his voice were worth more than his legal position suggested. James understood this as a challenge. In a household where legal authority was the only authority James had over a brother who was plainly his intellectual equal. Having that authority questioned was intolerable. The political crisis that briefly transferred power to Franklin only sharpened the underlying tension. When the colonial authorities jailed James in 1722 for content they found offensive, the paper needed someone to run it. Benjamin was the only person in the shop capable of doing so. For several weeks, he made the editorial decisions. He inserted what he described as pasquinades against the governors, sharp, pointed material that delighted James when he heard about it and raised Benjamin's profile among readers who were paying attention. Then James was released, and Benjamin was the apprentice again. The legal manoeuvring that followed James's release is worth understanding carefully, because Franklin himself admitted it was ethically compromised. The Assembly had ordered that James Franklin could no longer print the Quran under his own name. To get around this, James released Benjamin from his original indenture publicly, a document that could be shown to authorities if challenged, while simultaneously having Benjamin sign a new secret indenture that preserved the actual terms of the apprenticeship. It was a workaround designed to protect James's business. Benjamin signed both documents. He later called the use of that public discharge as an escape route one of the first real errors of his life. The logic of what he did was available to him at the time. The secret contract was not legally visible, so technically he could treat himself as free. But he knew the secret contract was real. He had signed it. Using the public discharge as a shield while ignoring the private obligation was a form of bad faith, and he recorded it as such. He did not excuse himself with the argument that James had treated him poorly, even though James had. He held the two things separately. James's conduct was one matter, his own conduct was another. This moral precision is significant. Franklin was 17 years old when he made this decision, and he was making it under genuine pressure, a physically abusive employer, a legally binding contract he had not freely chosen, a city that had closed its other printing houses to him on James's instruction. By the standards most people would apply to a 17-year-old in those circumstances, using a legal technicality to escape was not only understandable, but sensible. Franklin did not apply those standards to himself. He applied a harder one, and he wrote it down so clearly that there was no possibility of later softening it. This habit of separating the question of what was done to him from the question of what he did in response runs through everything that follows in his life. It is not the same as passivity, and it is not the same as forgiveness. It is something more structural, a refusal to allow the behaviour of others to determine the standard by which he judged his own behaviour. Whatever James had done, Franklin remained accountable to his own record. James went to every printer in Boston. He made certain that no one would hire his brother. The message was clear enough: if you cannot be controlled by contract, you can be controlled by exclusion. Boston was a small city with a small number of printing houses, and James had relationships with all of them. Benjamin found every door closed. What James had not calculated, and what this entire chapter of Franklin's life keeps demonstrating, was the difference between closing a door and eliminating an option. A door closed in Boston was not a door closed everywhere. The colonies were large. Philadelphia had printers. New York had printers. The continent was not James Franklin's to administer. The boat from Boston to New York took 3 days. Franklin had told no one where he was going, except a friend he trusted to keep the secret. He had sold some books to cover the fare. He arrived in New York with very little money, no contacts of any weight, and a story he could not tell too clearly without revealing that he had broken from his apprenticeship under circumstances that a stranger might judge harshly. New York offered nothing. The only printer in the city, a man named William Bradford, told Franklin he had no work available, but suggested his son Andrew, operating a press in Philadelphia, might need a hand. It was not an invitation. It was a redirection, the kind of polite dismissal that sends a problem in another direction without solving it. Franklin took it anyway, because it was the only direction available. Getting to Philadelphia from New York in 1723 was not a simple matter of booking passage. Franklin crossed to the New Jersey shore, walked nearly 30 miles through rain to reach Burlington, waited days for a boat that would take him down the Delaware River, and helped row part of the journey himself when the wind dropped and the vessel stalled. He arrived on a Sunday morning, exhausted, wet, and carrying a spare shirt and stockings stuffed into his pockets because his trunk had been sent ahead by a different route. He walked into Philadelphia eating a large bread roll, one under each arm and one in his mouth, because he was hungry and the rolls were what he could afford. A young woman watched him from her doorway, and he noticed her noticing him. He was aware, without needing to be told, that he looked absurd. He did not stop walking. That moment, dishevelled, ridiculous, entirely without standing in a city that had no reason to care whether he lived or failed, is the honest entry point into what Philadelphia would become for him. There was no welcome. There was no network waiting to receive him. There was a street, a roll, and a pair of eyes watching from a doorway. He found lodging, cleaned himself up as best he could, and went the next morning to Andrew Bradford's printing house. Bradford's father was already there, having travelled ahead on horseback. The son received Franklin civilly, gave him breakfast, and told him there was no work. He had recently hired someone. He mentioned that another printer, a man named Samuel Keimer, had just set up in the city and might have need of a compositor. Franklin went directly to Keimer. What he found there was a print shop that existed more in Keimer's ambitions than in its actual equipment. An old damaged press and a small font of worn-out type with which Keimer was attempting, alone, to print an elegy for a recently deceased local figure. Keimer could set type after a fashion. He could not operate the press. Franklin looked at the situation, assessed it in the time it takes to walk across a room, and offered to help finish the elegy. This is the same instinct visible in the midnight press of Section 1, the immediate conversion of someone else's limitation into his own leverage. He was not being generous, he was being strategic, in the way that people who have nothing are sometimes forced to be strategic, by making themselves useful before anyone has formally agreed to need them. What Franklin also noticed, standing in Keimer's shop that morning, was a scene that told him something important about the city he had just entered. Bradford Sr. was present. Keimer, not knowing that Bradford's father was the father of his main competitor, began talking openly about his business plans, his prospects, his intended customers. His strategy for taking the dominant share of Philadelphia's printing trade. Bradford Sr. drew him out with careful questions, listening to everything. Franklin watched this unfold and recorded his conclusion plainly. One of these men was a cunning old fox, and the other a perfect novice. Philadelphia's printing trade was not controlled by people who were difficult to outmaneuver. It was controlled by people who had simply been there longest. He moved into lodgings arranged by Keimer, a room in the house of a man named Reed, whose daughter was the same young woman who had watched him from the doorway the morning he arrived. The city was smaller than it appeared. Keimer's limitations became Franklin's opportunity almost immediately. Franklin repaired the damaged press, trained himself on the specific quirks of the worn type, and began producing work at a speed and quality that Keimer could not match and did not fully understand. Within weeks, he was not just an employee, he was the functional centre of the shop's entire output. Keimer needed him more than he had anticipated needing anyone. This imbalance had consequences Franklin had not yet learned to manage. When a letter arrived from his brother-in-law Robert Holmes, who had heard of Benjamin's whereabouts and written urging him to return to Boston, Franklin composed a reply explaining his reasons for leaving with enough clarity and force that Holmes showed it to Governor William Keith of Pennsylvania, who happened to be present. Keith read the letter, was struck by the quality of the reasoning, and declared that the young man who wrote it ought to be encouraged. He proposed to help Franklin set up his own press. He said he would provide letters of credit and letters of introduction. Franklin was 18 years old. A colonial governor was standing in his corner, apparently without reservation, offering to sponsor his independence. It seemed like the intervention that changed everything, the moment when the world, which had spent years trying to stop him, suddenly reversed course and opened a door. He believed it. That belief was the mistake. Keith's promises had a quality that Franklin did not yet have enough experience to identify. They were enthusiastic, specific, and entirely unattached to any concrete action. The letters of credit would be arranged. The introductions would be written. Franklin should go to London to purchase the equipment himself, and everything would be in place before he sailed. Franklin prepared for the voyage. He told almost no one, wanting to avoid complications, including any conversation with Josiah Franklin, who Keith had suggested might provide startup capital, and who Franklin suspected would not. He was right about his father. Josiah Franklin, when consulted, told his son plainly that he was too young to be setting up in business, and that the governor's offer, whatever its intentions, was not the kind of foundation on which a prudent man built. Franklin dismissed this assessment. He was 18, and a colonial governor had noticed him. The boat from Boston to New York took 3 days. Franklin had told no one where he was going, except a friend he trusted to keep the secret. He had sold some books to cover the fare. He arrived in New York with very little money, no contacts of any weight, and a story he could not tell too clearly without revealing that he had broken from his apprenticeship under circumstances that a stranger might judge harshly. New York offered nothing. The only printer in the city, a man named William Bradford, told Franklin he had no work available, but suggested his son Andrew. Operating a press in Philadelphia might need a hand. It was not an invitation. It was a redirection, the kind of polite dismissal that sends a problem in another direction without solving it. Franklin took it anyway, because it was the only direction available. Getting to Philadelphia from New York in 1723 was not a simple matter of booking passage. Franklin crossed to the New Jersey shore, walked nearly 30 miles through rain to reach Burlington, waited days for a boat that would take him down the Delaware River, and helped row part of the journey himself when the wind dropped and the vessel stalled. He arrived on a Sunday morning exhausted, wet, and carrying a spare shirt and stockings stuffed into his pockets because his trunk had been sent ahead by a different route. He walked into Philadelphia eating a large bread roll, one under each arm and one in his mouth, because he was hungry and the rolls were what he could afford. A young woman watched him from her doorway, and he noticed her noticing him. He was aware, without needing to be told, that he looked absurd. He did not stop walking. That moment, dishevelled, ridiculous, entirely without standing in a city that had no reason to care whether he lived or failed, is the honest entry point into what Philadelphia would become for him. There was no welcome. There was no network waiting to receive him. There was a street, a roll, and a pair of eyes watching from a doorway. He found lodging, cleaned himself up as best he could, and went the next morning to Andrew Bradford's printing house. Bradford's father was already there, having travelled ahead on horseback. The son received Franklin civilly, gave him breakfast, and told him there was no work. He had recently hired someone. He mentioned that another printer, a man named Samuel Keimer, had just set up in the city and might have need of a compositor. Franklin went directly to Keimer. What he found there was a print shop that existed more in Keimer's ambitions than in its actual equipment, an old damaged press and a small font of worn-out type, with which Keimer was attempting, alone, to print an elegy for a recently deceased local figure. Keimer could set type after a fashion. He could not operate the press. Franklin looked at the situation, assessed it in the time it takes to walk across a room, and offered to help finish the elegy. This is the same instinct visible in the midnight press of the cold open, the immediate conversion of someone else's limitation into his own leverage. He was not being generous. He was being strategic, in the way that people who have nothing are sometimes forced to be strategic by making themselves useful before anyone has formally agreed to need them. What Franklin also noticed, standing in Keimer's shop that morning, was a scene that told him something important about the city he had just entered. Bradford Sr. was present. Keimer, not knowing that Bradford's father was the father of his main competitor, began talking openly about his business plans, his prospects, his intended customers, his strategy for taking the dominant share of Philadelphia's printing trade. Bradford Sr. drew him out with careful questions, listening to everything. Franklin watched this unfold and recorded his conclusion plainly. One of these men was a cunning old fox, and the other a perfect novice. Philadelphia's printing trade was not controlled by people who were difficult to outmaneuver. It was controlled by people who had simply been there longest. He moved into lodgings arranged by Keimer, a room in the house of a man named Reed, whose daughter was the same young woman who had watched him from the doorway the morning he arrived. The city was smaller than it appeared. Keimer's limitations became Franklin's opportunity almost immediately. Franklin repaired the damaged press, trained himself on the specific quirks of the worn type, and began producing work at a speed and quality that Keimer could not match and did not fully understand. Within weeks, he was not just an employee, he was the functional centre of the shop's entire output. Keimer needed him more than he had anticipated needing anyone. This imbalance had consequences Franklin had not yet learned to manage. When a letter arrived from his brother-in-law Robert Holmes, who had heard of Benjamin's whereabouts and written urging him to return to Boston, Franklin composed a reply explaining his reasons for leaving with enough clarity and force that Holmes showed it to Governor William Keith of Pennsylvania, who happened to be present. Keith read the letter, was struck by the quality of the reasoning, and declared that the young man who wrote it ought to be encouraged. He proposed to help Franklin set up his own press. He said he would provide letters of credit and letters of introduction. Franklin was 18 years old, a colonial governor was standing in his corner, apparently without reservation, offering to sponsor his independence. It seemed like the intervention that changed everything, the moment when the world, which had spent years trying to stop him, suddenly reversed course and opened a door. He believed it. That belief was the mistake. Keith's promises had a quality that Franklin did not yet have enough experience to identify. They were enthusiastic, specific, and entirely unattached to any concrete action. The letters of credit would be arranged. The introductions would be written. Franklin should go to London to purchase the equipment himself, and everything would be in place before he sailed. Franklin prepared for the voyage. He told almost no one, wanting to avoid complications, including any conversation with Josiah Franklin, who Keith had suggested might provide start-up capital and who Franklin suspected would not. He was right about his father. Josiah Franklin, when consulted, told his son plainly that he was too young to be setting up in business, and that the governor's offer, whatever its intentions, was not the kind of foundation on which a prudent man built. Franklin dismissed this assessment. He was 18, and a colonial governor had noticed him. The ship that would carry him to London was called the London Hope. Franklin boarded it in late 1724, expecting to find Keith's letters of credit among the dispatches held for passengers. They were not there. He asked about them. He was told the governor's correspondence was in another bag to be delivered once they were underway. When the bag was finally opened at sea and the letters examined, none of them were from Keith. None of them were addressed to Franklin. None of them existed. London in 1724 was the largest city in the Western world. Its population was somewhere above 600,000 people. Its printing trade alone employed hundreds of workers across dozens of houses, producing everything from political pamphlets to scientific correspondence to daily newspapers. For a young man who had spent his entire life in colonial cities where a single printing house constituted a significant institution, arriving in London was like stepping from a room into a continent. Franklin arrived with no letters, no credit, and no sponsor. What he had was a trade, a willingness to work, and the particular kind of clarity that comes from having just watched your last external support dissolve somewhere over the Atlantic. Keith's betrayal had stripped away every plan. What remained had to be built from the ground up. In a city that had no particular reason to notice one more young colonial looking for employment, he found work almost immediately. A printer named Samuel Palmer, operating out of Bartholomew Close, took him on. The house was a serious one. It handled substantial work, employed skilled compositors, and operated at a pace and volume that far exceeded anything Franklin had encountered in Philadelphia or Boston. He applied himself with the same focused intensity he brought to every working environment, and he was good enough at the trade that Palmer noticed. But London was expensive, and Franklin had arrived with a companion who made it more so. A young man named James Ralph had travelled with him from Philadelphia, a friend who had ambitions toward writing and the theatre, but no particular skills that London's competitive markets were interested in paying. Ralph spent Franklin's money while pursuing prospects that consistently failed to materialise. He attempted the stage and was turned away. He approached publishers and was declined. He tried school teaching in the countryside under an assumed name. He borrowed Franklin's name, in fact, which Franklin noted with a dryness that suggests he found it more irritating than amusing. The money Franklin earned at Palmer's went largely toward keeping both of them afloat. This was not generosity in any pure sense. It was the loyalty of a young man who had not yet learned to distinguish between friendship and financial obligation. He recorded the arrangement plainly and without self-pity, but also without excusing himself for the choices that sustained it. Ralph eventually broke with him over an incident Franklin described as another error of his life, and the breach, while painful, had one practical consequence Franklin acknowledged openly: it relieved him of a very heavy financial burden. What London gave Franklin, independent of Ralph and independent of Palmer's press, was access to a city of ideas operating at a scale he had never encountered. He moved through it with deliberate curiosity. He formed connections with booksellers, philosophers, and men of science. A surgeon named Lyons, who had read a philosophical pamphlet Franklin had written and printed at Palmer's, introduced him into circles where serious intellectual exchange was the normal currency of conversation. Through Lyons, he met Bernard Mandeville, whose work on private vices and public benefits had unsettled comfortable moral assumptions across Europe. He was introduced to a physician named Pemberton, who promised to arrange a meeting with Isaac Newton, a promise that was never kept, which Franklin noted without apparent bitterness, as one of the minor disappointments of an otherwise productive period. The pamphlet Franklin had written and printed at Palmer's is worth understanding on its own terms, because it illustrates something important about where his thinking was at 19. The piece was a philosophical argument, dense, ambitious, and built around the proposition that free will did not exist, and that, by extension, vice and virtue were not meaningful categories. He had reasoned himself, through a chain of logic he found compelling at the time, into a position that stripped moral accountability from human behaviour entirely. Palmer, who was a serious man, printed it and then told Franklin directly that it was an abominable piece of work. Franklin later agreed. He came to regard it as one of the errors of his life, not because the reasoning was sloppy, but because he eventually concluded that a doctrine which dissolved moral distinctions was not merely philosophically questionable, but practically dangerous. He had watched what happened to people who genuinely believed that their actions carried no moral weight. The results had not recommended the position. This reversal is not a small thing. Franklin was 19 years old, working in a London printing house, capable of producing a philosophical argument sophisticated enough to attract the attention of serious thinkers, and capable, within a relatively short period, of subjecting that same argument to honest scrutiny and concluding he had been wrong. The willingness to change a position in response to evidence, including the evidence of observed human behaviour, was not common at any age. In a teenager, it was remarkable. He spent nearly 2 years in London. He worked at Palmer's and later moved to a larger and more prestigious house run by a printer named Watts near Lincoln's Inn Fields. At Watts's establishment, he encountered the full professional culture of the London printing trade, its hierarchies, its customs, its informal systems of mutual obligation among workers. He navigated these with his usual combination of observation and adaptation, though he also pushed back where the customs struck him as irrational. The pressman at Watts's house had a tradition of demanding payment from new workers, a kind of initiation fee framed as an offering to the chapel, the printer's term for their workplace community. Franklin, who had been baptized a Presbyterian and had by this point developed views on organized religion that made formal ritual feel hollow, initially refused to pay. He was subjected to small but persistent harassments, type disturbed, work disrupted, until he concluded that the cost of resistance exceeded the cost of the fee and paid it. He described this as buying peace rather than accepting a principle. That distinction mattered to him. He paid the money. He did not concede the point. What he was also doing in London, in whatever hours remained after work and after the social engagements that Ralph had drawn him into, was reading. The city's booksellers operated informal lending arrangements, and Franklin made use of every one he could find. He was building, in the margins of a working life in a foreign city, the intellectual foundation that his colonial education had never provided. Philosophy, science, natural history, political theory, he moved through it without a syllabus, guided only by his own judgment about what mattered. There is a tendency, when telling the story of a person who eventually succeeds, to treat every difficult period as preparation. London becomes the furnace that forges Franklin. The hardship becomes the tuition. The errors become the lessons. This framing is not entirely wrong, but it is too clean. It smooths over the fact that while Franklin was in London, he did not know he would return to Philadelphia and build something significant. He did not know Denham would offer him a passage home. He did not know that the 2 years he was spending in a foreign city, working for wages and watching his savings disappear into Ralph's ambitions, would eventually resolve into anything at all. What he knew, day to day, was that he was a skilled tradesman in a city full of skilled tradesmen, with no capital, no patron, and a set of social obligations that were costing him more than he could comfortably afford. That is the honest texture of those 2 years. The meaning came later. The living of it was considerably less tidy. What London did give Franklin, in ways he could not have anticipated when he boarded the London Hope, was a direct encounter with the upper registers of European intellectual life at the precise moment when that life was producing some of its most consequential ideas. The early 18th century in London was not a quiet period for thought. The scientific revolution that Newton had anchored in the previous century was still generating ripples through every field of inquiry. Political philosophy was reshaping how educated people understood the relationship between individuals and governments. Moral philosophy was wrestling seriously with questions about human nature, self-interest, and the foundations of social order. Franklin, working his press by day and reading everything he could find by night, was absorbing all of it. The philosophical pamphlet he wrote at Palmer's house, the one Palmer printed and then condemned, had emerged from this absorption. The argument it made, that free will was illusory and moral categories therefore meaningless, drew on real philosophical traditions that serious thinkers had developed seriously. Franklin had not invented the position. He had reasoned his way into it by engaging, as honestly as he could, with the arguments available to him. That he subsequently reasoned his way back out of it is equally significant. The reversal was not the result of social pressure or religious obligation. Palmer's criticism stung, but Franklin did not abandon the pamphlet because Palmer disapproved. He abandoned it because he watched what moral vacancy looked like in practice, in the behaviour of people around him who had genuinely internalised the idea that their actions carried no weight, and concluded that the doctrine produced outcomes he could not endorse. This is a different kind of learning than anything a school provides. It is the learning that comes from holding an idea long enough to watch it produce consequence, and then being honest about what those consequences reveal. Franklin was doing this continuously in London, testing propositions against evidence, updating his positions, refusing to protect conclusions from the scrutiny of experience. The body was part of this, not just the mind. Franklin was physically vigorous in ways that distinguished him from many of the men he worked alongside. At Watts's printing house, where he moved after Palmer's, he worked initially among the pressmen, the physically demanding side of the trade, where the heavy work of operating the press was done. His colleagues in this room drank beer throughout the working day, believing it gave them strength for the labour. Franklin drank water. He argued that the nutrition in the bread he ate at breakfast was more sustaining than the small alcohol content in the beer, and that his output over the course of a day proved it. His colleagues called him the Water American and regarded his habits with scepticism, but they noticed that he could carry more type up the stairs the men who had been doing the work longer. He swam in the Thames. This was not a recreational habit in any ordinary sense. Swimming was not a common skill in 18th century England, and the Thames was a working river, not a place where gentlemen exercised. Franklin swam distances that impressed onlookers and demonstrated techniques that attracted serious attention from at least one man of standing who considered for a time hiring him to teach swimming to his sons. Franklin was briefly tempted by the idea of remaining in London as a swimming instructor rather than returning to the printing trade. He abandoned the idea, but the episode reveals something about how his mind operated. He was always assessing what he had, what it was worth, and whether there was a better market for it than the one he was currently in. The social world he moved through in London was similarly eclectic. The circles that Lyons and Mandeville introduced him to were not the elite of English society. They were the working intellectuals, the men who produced ideas for a living or alongside a living, who gathered in coffee houses and taverns to argue about philosophy, science, politics and human nature. Franklin was comfortable in these rooms in a way that his colonial background might have suggested he wouldn't be. He had opinions, the capacity to defend them, and the equally important capacity to listen when someone else's argument was stronger than his own. These were not common qualities in combination, and they opened doors that money alone could not have opened. The encounter with Hans Sloane is a small example of how this worked in practice. Sloane was a physician and collector of considerable standing. His collection would eventually form the foundation of the British Museum. He heard that Franklin had brought from America a purse made of asbestos, a material whose resistance to fire made it genuinely curious to a collector of natural specimens. Sloane sought Franklin out, invited him to his house in Bloomsbury Square, showed him the rest of the collection, and bought the purse for what Franklin described as a very handsome price. This was not a social relationship between equals. Sloane was established, wealthy and famous. Franklin was a 20-year-old colonial printer. What made the meeting possible was the object, and what made it productive was Franklin's ability to conduct himself in Sloane's house with enough intelligence and composure that the transaction left both parties satisfied. He was learning, in other words, not just the content of ideas, but the social grammar of the world that produced and exchanged them. How to enter a room where you had no formal standing. How to hold a conversation with someone whose education far exceeded yours without either false deference or false equality. How to be taken seriously by people who had no structural reason to take you seriously. This education had no name and no institution behind it. It was acquired entirely through practice, in real rooms with real consequences. The relationship with Ralph, meanwhile, continued to drain him. Ralph had found a milliner named Mrs. T, with whom he had taken up lodgings, and had then departed for the countryside to try school teaching, leaving the woman in financial difficulty and turning to Franklin to manage both the correspondence and the practical support she required. Franklin, lending money he could not spare and spending time on a situation he had not created, eventually behaved in a way toward Mrs. T that he later described plainly as an error. He took advantage of her vulnerable situation in a manner she rightly rejected. She told Ralph. Ralph, upon returning to London, informed Franklin that he considered all debts between them cancelled by this conduct. Franklin accepted this accounting. He lost the friendship and the money simultaneously, and he recorded both losses without attempting to redistribute the blame. What he noted, with a candour that is almost startling, is that losing Ralph's friendship also relieved him of the ongoing financial burden of sustaining it. There is no self-congratulation in this observation. It is simply a man taking stock of what a bad situation had actually cost and what its resolution had actually returned. Denham was dead within a year of their return. The shop he had promised to hand over to Franklin, the structured future that had made leaving London feel like a rational decision rather than a retreat, dissolved with him. Franklin was back in Philadelphia with no patron, no capital, and no arrangement that survived the man who had made it. He returned to Keimer. There was no theatre in this, it was simply the available option, and Franklin was not a person who confused pride with strategy. Keimer had a press. Franklin knew how to run it better than Keimer did. The terms were worse than before, and the relationship had not improved in his absence, but it was work, and work was the only currency Franklin had ever been able to generate reliably from scratch. What had changed was not the external landscape. Philadelphia's printing trade was still the same narrow field it had always been, dominated by the same two inadequate operators Franklin had assessed on his first morning in the city. What had changed was the person navigating that landscape. London had done something to his calibration that could not be undone. He had worked in the best printing houses in the world's largest city. He had sat in rooms with men whose intellectual range far exceeded anything colonial Philadelphia had produced. He had measured himself against a larger standard and come away not diminished but clarified. Keimer sensed this, and it made him uncomfortable in the specific way that employers are made uncomfortable by employees they cannot afford to lose and cannot afford to trust. He gave Franklin work that was beneath him. He watched him with a suspicion that Franklin recorded without apparent resentment, simply as another feature of the environment to be navigated rather than fought. The more consequential reckoning happening during this period was not professional. It was personal, and it involved Miss Reed. Franklin had left Philadelphia for London in 1724 without making any formal commitment to her. During his time abroad, he had written her a single letter informing her that he was unlikely to return soon. That was all. She had waited for a period, received no further word, and eventually, under pressure from her mother, and in a state of what Franklin described plainly as neglect on his own part, had married another man, a potter named Rogers. The marriage was a failure almost immediately. Rogers turned out to have debts, a poor character, and possibly a wife in England already. He eventually disappeared to the West Indies, leaving Miss Reed, now Miss Reed again, in everything but legal name, in a situation that was ambiguous, unhappy, and not of her own making. Franklin called his conduct toward her during those London years one of the great errors of his life. He did not qualify this or distribute the responsibility elsewhere. He had been engaged to her in spirit, if not in formal contract. He had left, written once, and gone silent. Whatever she had endured afterward traced, in part, directly to that silence. He married her in September of 1730. The legal complications around Rogers were real, there was no confirmed proof of his death, and without it, a formal marriage carried technical risk. Franklin and Deborah Reed took each other as husband and wife under a common law arrangement that acknowledged the difficulty without being paralysed by it. He described it as correcting, as well as he could, a great error of his youth. That phrase, as well as he could, is precise. He was not claiming to have repaired what had been broken. He was claiming to have done the most that the available circumstances permitted. The distinction was characteristic. Franklin did not traffic in the language of redemption or transformation. He trafficked in the language of correction, adjustment, and improvement. Errors were not erased. They were reckoned with, compensated for where possible, and then incorporated into the ongoing account of a life that was always being revised but never fully restarted. The break with Keimer came in 1728, and it came in the way most of Franklin's breaks came, not through confrontation, but through the quiet accumulation of conditions that made the next step unavoidable. Keimer had grown increasingly resentful of an employee who was visibly more capable than he was, and increasingly nervous about what that employee might eventually do with that capability. He was right to be nervous. Franklin had already been approached by a friend named Hugh Meredith, whose father was willing to put up the capital for a new printing house if Franklin would supply the skill and the management. The offer was specific, the terms were reasonable, and Franklin accepted it. He opened his own printing house in Philadelphia in 1728 at the age of 22. He had no family money behind him, no influential patron with reliable promises, that particular lesson had been thoroughly absorbed, and no inherited advantage of any kind. What he had was a partner whose father had invested in the venture, a press, a set of types, and a reputation built entirely through the quality of work he had produced inside other men's shops. The competitive landscape had not changed. Bradford still held the postmaster position and the circulation advantages it provided. Keimer still occupied the same square footage in the city's printing trade that he had always occupied, diminished but not yet gone. Franklin entered this market without the structural advantages either of his competitors possessed, and with a deliberateness about his own conduct that went considerably beyond simply working hard. He dressed plainly, not as an affectation or a performance of humility, but as a calculated signal. A man in plain clothes pushing a wheelbarrow of paper through the streets of Philadelphia is communicating something specific to the merchants and tradesmen who see him. He is communicating that he is not spending money on appearances, in a city where credit relationships were personal and reputation was collateral. This mattered. The merchants who imported stationery and paper goods were watching. The people who needed printing done were watching. Franklin understood that in the absence of inherited standing, every visible behaviour was a form of advertisement, and he managed his visible behaviour accordingly. He never went fishing. He never went hunting. He was not seen at places of public amusement. When a book occasionally pulled him away from work, he made sure it happened quietly enough to attract no notice and no comment. He later wrote that he took care not only to be really industrious and frugal, but also to avoid every appearance of the contrary. The distinction between the reality and the appearance was not cynical. He was genuinely working the hours he appeared to be working. But he was also aware that appearances had independent value, and that managing them was a legitimate part of building a business from nothing. The wheelbarrow deserves particular attention because Franklin himself drew attention to it. Carrying paper home from the warehouse in a wheelbarrow rather than hiring someone to do it was not strictly necessary. He could have paid for a delivery. He chose not to, and he chose to do it in a way that was visible to his neighbours on the street. The merchants who watched him noted it. The story of the young printer who wheeled his own paper home circulated in the way that stories about character always circulate in communities where everyone's credit depends on everyone else's assessment of their reliability. Franklin was not performing industriousness for an audience he secretly disdained. He was performing it for an audience whose opinion he needed and whose opinion he had earned the right to shape. Within a relatively short period, the strategy produced measurable results. Keimer's business contracted steadily. His apprentice, David Harry, who bought Keimer's materials when Keimer was finally forced to sell and leave for Barbados, attempted to compete with Franklin directly. Franklin had assessed Harry accurately from the beginning. A young man allied to a respectable family, proud, inclined toward the pleasures of a gentleman's life, and entirely unsuited to the disciplined monotony that building a printing business required. Harry's shop attracted attention briefly, then debt, then neglect, and then silence. He eventually followed Keimer to Barbados. There the apprentice employed his former master as a journeyman, and they quarrelled continuously until Harry too was forced to sell his press and return to his original occupation. Franklin recorded this sequence without gloating. He had seen it coming from the moment Harry rejected his proposal of partnership, and he had simply waited for the arithmetic to complete itself. The partnership with Meredith also required resolution. Hugh Meredith was an honest man, but not a printer by temperament. His father's capital had been only partially delivered, leaving debts that were straining the business at precisely the moment it needed stability. Meredith himself recognised the situation clearly and proposed the terms of separation without rancour. Franklin would assume the partnership's debts, return what capital had been invested, and pay Meredith a modest sum and the cost of a new saddle. Meredith would go to North Carolina and resume farming, which was what he had always been suited for. Franklin accepted immediately. Two friends, Robert Grace and William Coleman, each offered him half the capital he needed to cover the debts and continue alone. He accepted from each in equal measure, deliberately avoiding any appearance of favouring one over the other. He paid what was owed, took full ownership of the business, and published an advertisement informing the public that the partnership had been dissolved. He was now entirely his own. No partner, no investor with ongoing claims, no arrangement that could be disrupted by another person's decisions. He had arrived at this position not through a single dramatic move, but through the patient management of a sequence of smaller ones, each resolving a dependency, each reducing the number of variables outside his control. The business expanded methodically from this base. Franklin had written an anonymous pamphlet on the question of paper currency. Pennsylvania was debating whether to issue new paper money, and the wealthy interests of the province were aligned against it. Franklin argued the case for the new emission with enough clarity and force that the pamphlet shifted the terms of the public debate. The Assembly passed the measure. The friends Franklin had acquired in the House, recognising that he had rendered the province a genuine service, gave him the contract to print the new bills. It was, as he noted, a lucrative and timely piece of work. A printing house, however well run, is a machine for producing other people's ideas. Franklin had spent the better part of a decade making that machine function at the highest level his circumstances permitted. But the mind operating the machine had its own requirements for argument, for exchange, for the particular kind of thinking that only happens when one intelligent person is forced to defend a position against another intelligent person who disagrees with it. Philadelphia in the late 1720s did not offer many formal venues for this. Franklin built one. He called it the Junto. It was founded in 1727 while he was still working for Keimer and before the printing house existed in its independent form. The founding membership was 12 tradesmen, clerks, and self-educated men of roughly Franklin's own station. None of them wealthy, none of them connected to the established upper layers of Philadelphia society, all of them curious about ideas and willing to submit those ideas to examination. They met on Friday evenings, initially at a member's house, later at a tavern, and the meetings followed a structure that Franklin designed with the same deliberateness he brought to everything else. Each member was required, on a rotating basis, to produce a question for group discussion. The questions ranged across moral philosophy, natural science, political theory, and practical affairs. Members were expected to defend positions, challenge each other's reasoning, and update their views in response to arguments they could not counter. There were rules against expressions of dogmatic opinion and against personal attacks. The goal was productive disagreement, not the kind of contentious point scoring that Franklin had recognised, even as a teenager debating with John Collins in Boston, as a habit that generated heat without generating light. This was not a book club with philosophical pretensions. It was a functioning intelligence network, and Franklin designed it to be one. The members represented different trades and different corners of Philadelphia's commercial and civic life. Between them, they had access to information about the city's business conditions, its political dynamics, its emerging needs and unresolved problems that no individual member could have assembled alone. The Friday meetings were where this information was pooled and processed. What came out of that processing was repeatedly actionable. The library is the clearest early example. Members of the junto had noticed that the quality of discussion was limited by the quality of the books available to individual members. A man could only contribute what he had personally read. And the personal libraries of tradesmen in a colonial city were modest. Someone proposed collecting all members' books in the meeting room, creating a shared resource. They tried it. The arrangement worked imperfectly. Books were damaged, returned late, or not returned at all, and after about a year the experiment was quietly wound down. But the idea it generated was considerably larger than the experiment that produced it. Franklin took the basic logic of shared access to books and scaled it into a public institution. In 1731, he drafted a proposal for a subscription library, a formal organisation in which members paid an initial fee and annual dues in exchange for borrowing privileges from a centrally maintained collection. 50 people signed on at the start, each contributing 40 shillings initially and 10 shillings annually. The Library Company of Philadelphia was incorporated in 1742 and eventually grew to hold approximately 8,000 volumes, a philosophical apparatus, and a collection of natural curiosities. It became a model that was replicated across the colonies. The significance of this institution extends well beyond Franklin's personal intellectual interests. Pennsylvania at this time was, as one observer recorded, a province where most inhabitants were too immersed in business to engage seriously with scientific or literary pursuits. Those who were inclined toward learning found themselves constrained by the absence of collections large enough to support sustained inquiry. The library addressed this constraint not by waiting for wealthy patrons to endow a private institution, but by distributing the cost across a large enough group that each individual's contribution was manageable. It was, structurally, the same logic Franklin had applied to his own self-education in London, finding a way to access what he needed by building an arrangement that made access possible where none existed before. The junto itself continued operating long after the library had taken on its own institutional life. It became the seedbed from which a remarkable number of Philadelphia's civic improvements grew over the following 2 decades. Fire safety, street lighting, a city watch, a hospital, an academy, many of the organised responses to Philadelphia's practical problems as a growing city passed through the junto's Friday evening discussions before they reached any official body. Franklin was not always the initiator. He was consistently the person who understood how to move an idea from discussion to implementation, which is a different and in some ways rarer skill. He had learned something about this process that is worth understanding precisely. Good ideas proposed under the wrong name or attributed too visibly to the wrong person frequently died in Philadelphia's factional environment before they could produce any practical result. Franklin developed a habit of introducing improvements anonymously or through intermediaries, presenting proposals as if they had emerged from collective discussion rather than individual initiative, and generally making it easy for people with status and influence to claim ownership of ideas that he had originated. He was explicit about this strategy and unashamed of it. The goal was the outcome, not the credit, A man who needed credit in order to act was a man whose usefulness was limited to situations where credit was available. This approach sat in some tension with what he was building privately, which was a comprehensive personal reputation for exactly the qualities he was publicly underplaying: initiative, intelligence, civic concern. But the tension was not a contradiction. The public modesty was genuine in its function, while the private reputation was genuine in its substance. He was not pretending to be less than he was. He was managing the sequence in which his actual capacities became visible, so that by the time anyone thought to question them, the evidence was already too extensive to contest. The junto also gave Franklin something that the printing house, however successful, could not: a regular structure for sustained intellectual development. The questions the group examined were not merely practical. They engaged seriously with moral philosophy, with the nature of virtue, with the relationship between private interest and public good, with questions about what a well-ordered society owed its members and what its members owed it. These were not abstract exercises. They were, for Franklin, the conceptual raw material out of which his entire approach to public life was being built. He was also, during this same period, reading with the same voracious, systematic hunger he had always brought to books. His access had improved considerably. The library he had helped create gave him resources that his position as a working tradesman would otherwise have made inaccessible. He moved through natural philosophy, political theory, history, and moral science, not collecting information, but interrogating it, testing propositions against experience, discarding what failed the test and retaining what survived it. What emerged from this combination, the junto's structured argument, the library's extended resources, the printing house's daily encounter with the full range of colonial public discourse, was a man whose intellectual formation was unlike anything a conventional education could have produced. Conventional education in the 18th century was largely a matter of absorbing and reproducing what established authorities had already determined to be worth knowing. Franklin's formation was entirely different in structure. It was built around the question of what was actually true and actually useful, tested against evidence and argument rather than institutional authority. The junto gave Franklin a structure for collective intellectual development. What he built alongside it was something more private, a system designed to develop himself. He was somewhere in his early 20s when he designed it. The precise timing is less important than the conditions that produced it. He had returned from London having watched what moral vacancy looked like in practice. He had compiled, through his own behaviour, a short but significant list of errors, the pamphlet, Ralph, Misread, the exploited technicality of the indenture. He had concluded, without the assistance of any religious framework he still found credible, that truth, probity, and sincerity in transactions between people were not abstract virtues, but practical necessities, the actual foundations on which a functional life had to be built. He had written this conclusion in his journal and committed himself to it. The project that followed was an attempt to operationalize that commitment. He identified 13 specific virtues that he believed constituted the complete architecture of a well-lived practical life. They were temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. Each was given a short, precise definition, not a general aspiration, but a behavioural standard. Frugality, for instance, was defined as making no expense but what did good to others or yourself, and wasting nothing. Industry was defined as losing no time, always being employed in something useful, and cutting off all unnecessary actions. He made a small notebook. Each page was ruled into a grid, the 13 virtues listed down one side, the days of the week across the top. Every evening he reviewed the day and marked with a black dot any virtue he had violated. The goal was a clean page. A page with no marks represented a day in which he had met his own standard across all 13 categories simultaneously. He did not attempt all 13 at once. He focused on one virtue per week, giving it particular attention while maintaining the others as best he could, then rotating to the next. A complete cycle through all 13 took 13 weeks. He ran 4 complete cycles per year. He intended to continue this for the rest of his life. What happened in practice was more complicated than the design suggested. He never achieved a clean page for any sustained period. Order was the virtue that resisted him most persistently. He had a mind that generated and pursued ideas fluidly, and the disciplined external organisation that his definition of order required ran against the grain of how he naturally operated. He made some progress. He made less progress than he had hoped. He eventually concluded. With the characteristic dry honesty that runs through all of his self-assessment, that a perfect order was perhaps not achievable for a person of his particular temperament, and that a speckled axe might be better than a bright one that could not stay bright. That conclusion requires careful reading. It is sometimes cited as evidence that the project failed, or that Franklin was making peace with his own limitations. Neither interpretation is quite right. What he was actually doing was applying the same empirical standard to his self-improvement project that he applied to everything else, measuring the outcome against the cost, adjusting the expectation in response to the evidence, and refusing to treat an unachieved ideal as a reason to abandon the entire enterprise. The project did not produce perfection. He had not seriously expected it to. What it produced was a sustained, systematic attention to the gap between who he was and who he intended to be, and that attention had its own independent value. The virtue of humility presents a particular irony that Franklin himself acknowledged with something close to amusement. He added it to the list late, on the advice of a Quaker friend who told him, with admirable directness, that he was generally considered proud, and that his manner of argument, even when he was technically refraining from direct contradiction, carried a quality of condescension that people found difficult to accept. Franklin heard this, considered it, and added humility to the list. He defined it as imitating Jesus and Socrates. He also noted, with the same candour, that he was never able to make much progress on humility in its genuine form. He could perform the external behaviours of humility. He trained himself out of direct contradiction, abandoned phrases that carried an air of positive assertion, replaced expressions like certainly and undoubtedly with softer formulations like I conceive or I imagine. People noticed the change and responded to it more favourably. The conversations he was part of became more productive. He was more persuasive, not less, when he stopped insisting on being right in a way that made the other person feel they were being corrected. But he admitted openly that this was largely a performance of humility rather than its substance. The pride was still there. He had learned to manage its expression without eliminating its presence. He was not troubled by this admission. He recorded it as a fact about himself, neither confessed with anguish nor excused with rationalization, simply stated as one more data point in an ongoing account. This is the element of the Virtues Project that is most consistently misunderstood when it is discussed at all. It is tempting to read the project as evidence of Franklin's moral seriousness, which it is, but also to read his failure to achieve the stated goals as evidence of moral inadequacy. That reading misses what Franklin was actually doing. He was not running a religious program of self-purification. He was running an empirical experiment in behavioural self-management, with himself as both the experimenter and the subject. The results were mixed, as experimental results often are. He recorded them honestly and continued running the experiment. In 1732, Franklin began publishing an almanac under the name Richard Saunders. The choice of a pen name was deliberate and practical. Almanacs were among the most widely read publications in colonial America, consulted for weather predictions, astronomical tables, planting schedules, and the kind of condensed practical wisdom that a farming and trading population could apply directly to daily decisions. Several competing almanacs already existed in Philadelphia. Franklin was entering a crowded market, and he entered it wearing a mask. Richard Saunders was a fictional astronomer, modest, slightly bumbling, gently self-deprecating, and possessed of a wife named Bridget, who nagged him about his impractical devotion to stargazing while the household went without adequate income. The persona was carefully constructed to be approachable to readers who might have found a more authoritative voice off-putting. Poor Richard was not lecturing from above. He was a neighbour with opinions, sharing what he had figured out in the same imperfect way his readers were figuring things out themselves. The almanac sold approximately 10,000 copies in its first years of publication. In a colony whose total population was still measured in the tens of thousands, this was a circulation figure that represented genuine penetration into the reading public at almost every level. Farmers read it, merchants read it, tradesmen consulted it. It was, for many households, one of a very small number of printed publications that entered the home with any regularity. What distinguished Poor Richard from its competitors was not primarily the astronomical data, which was serviceable but not markedly superior. It was the maxims, short, memorable sentences scattered through the calendar pages that encoded practical advice about work, money, time, and character. These maxims addressed the reader directly, without condescension, in language plain enough to be understood by someone with minimal formal education, and pointed enough to stick in the memory after the almanac itself had been set down. The content of the maxims drew on a wide range of sources. Franklin assembled them from proverbs, classical literature, contemporary writing, and his own observation, selecting and often sharpening what he found. He was explicit about this process, acknowledging that the wisdom of the almanac was not original in any comprehensive sense. It was curated, distilled, and in many cases rewritten to improve its rhetorical force. A proverb that existed in a loose and unwieldy form in one source would appear in Poor Richard in a tighter, more memorable version. The ideas were old, the formulations were frequently new. This raises a question that Franklin did not avoid. What is the relationship between assembling other people's wisdom and producing something of genuine value? He did not treat this as a troubling tension. He treated it as a straightforward description of what useful intellectual work often involves, identifying what is true and worth knowing, stripping away what is obscure or redundant, and presenting what remains in a form that the widest possible audience can access and use. The almanac was not a work of original philosophy. It was a delivery system for practical wisdom, and Franklin evaluated it by whether it successfully delivered. The maxims that became most lastingly associated with Poor Richard cluster around the themes of industry, frugality, and the management of time. The argument running through them, taken collectively, is that the primary obstacle most people face in improving their material circumstances is not the hostility of the world, but the misuse of their own resources, particularly time and money. Poverty in this framing is less often the result of bad fortune than of small, repeated decisions that compound over years into a structural condition. The remedy is equally incremental, small, repeated decisions in the other direction, compounding in the opposite way. This argument was not neutral. It carried embedded assumptions about the relationship between individual behaviour and material outcomes that not everyone in colonial Pennsylvania experienced as accurate. For a tradesman with access to a market, some starting capital, and the physical capacity for sustained labour, the equation between industry and advancement had real predictive power. Franklin was such a person and had lived the equation directly. For people whose circumstances differed in any of those dimensions, whose access to markets was restricted, whose starting capital was negative rather than zero, whose labour was not their own to direct, the maxims described a world that existed at some distance from their actual situation. Franklin did not address this gap in the almanac. Whether he was unaware of it, aware of it and untroubled by it, or aware of it and making a deliberate choice to write for the audience he was writing for, is a question the record does not answer cleanly. What it does show is a man producing a text that was functionally useful to a large portion of its readers, genuinely influential in shaping how colonial Americans thought about work and worth, and also necessarily partial, a map of one part of the territory presented without explicit acknowledgement that the territory was larger than the map. The almanac ran continuously for 25 years. In the final year of publication, Franklin collected the maxims from all previous editions, revised and selected among them, and published them together in an address to the reader titled The Way to Wealth. This condensed version became one of the most widely reproduced texts of the 18th century. It was translated into multiple European languages, reprinted in publications across the continent, and eventually framed and hung on the walls of households in a country that would not exist for several more decades. The maxims travelled further than almost anything else Franklin produced. The irony embedded in this is considerable. Franklin, who had designed the 13 Virtues Project as a private instrument of self-improvement and acknowledged freely that it had worked imperfectly, was simultaneously producing and distributing a public version of the same argument. That disciplined behaviour produces material advancement in a form that reached tens of thousands of people who received it without the private qualifications. The notebook stayed private. The almanac sold 10,000 copies a year. This does not make Franklin a hypocrite. It makes him a communicator who understood the difference between what is true in its full complexity and what is useful when rendered in a form accessible to a mass audience. The full complexity of his views on virtue, self-improvement, and the limits of individual effort was available in his private writings. The almanac was a different instrument designed for a different purpose, operating at a different level of resolution. He did not confuse the two. What Poor Richard also gave Franklin, beyond its civic and commercial reach, was a sustained exercise in understanding how language functions as a tool. Every maxim was a small engineering problem. How do you compress a genuine insight into a sentence short enough to be remembered and sharp enough to be felt? He worked at this problem for 25 years, producing thousands of attempts, most of which did not survive his own editing process. The ones that did survive demonstrate a command of the compressed rhetorical form that had no parallel in colonial American writing. By the mid-1730s, Franklin had built something that no amount of external obstruction had been able to prevent. The printing house was stable and expanding. The almanac was reaching thousands of readers annually. The junto was generating civic improvements that were reshaping daily life in Philadelphia. The library was open and growing. He had, through a combination of discipline, system building, and the patient management of appearances and relationships, converted an entry with nothing into a position of genuine local consequence. The world that had tried to stop him now tried something different. It tried to absorb him. In 1736, Franklin was appointed clerk of the Pennsylvania General Assembly. The position was not glamorous. It involved recording proceedings, managing documents, and maintaining the administrative machinery that kept the legislature functioning. But it placed him inside the room where Pennsylvania's political decisions were made, gave him relationships with the men who made them, and provided a platform from which larger opportunities could be observed and eventually pursued. He was reappointed by succeeding assemblies for several years running, which meant that each new group of representatives, arriving with their own priorities and allegiances, looked at the record of the clerk's performance and concluded he was worth keeping. In 1737, the postmaster position in Philadelphia became available. Franklin took it. This was the same structural advantage that Bradford had held over him for years. The ability to circulate printed material through the postal system gave the postmaster's newspaper a reach that competitors without the position simply could not match. Bradford had used this advantage ungenerously, actively working to prevent Franklin's paper from moving through the mail during the years when Franklin had been building from below. Now the position had changed hands. Franklin did not retaliate. He had the mechanism and the history to justify using it as Bradford had used it, but he did not. He allowed Bradford's paper to continue circulating through the post on the same terms as his own. He recorded this decision without extended commentary, as if the alternative had not seriously presented itself. Whether this was genuine magnanimity, a calculated recognition that petty retaliation would cost him more in reputation than it gained in competitive advantage, or some combination of both, is a question he did not resolve for the record. What he noted was that Bradford's earlier behaviour had been ungenerous, and that his own nobleness of soul prevented him from responding in kind. That phrase, nobleness of soul, is the only moment in this episode where Franklin allows himself a description that sounds like self-congratulation. It sits slightly oddly in a narrative that is otherwise so carefully stripped of that quality. He may have meant it ironically, he may have meant it plainly. The record supports either reading, which is itself characteristic of a man who understood that the most durable self-presentation is one that cannot be fully pinned down. The civic responsibilities accumulating around him during this period went beyond the assembly clerkship and the postmaster position. Philadelphia was a growing city with the infrastructure problems of all growing cities, inadequate fire protection, inconsistent street lighting, a night watch that was not doing its job with sufficient reliability. Franklin engaged with each of these systematically, in the manner the junto had trained him for, identifying the problem precisely, designing a practical response, building the coalition of support required to implement it, and then stepping back from the credit in ways that made implementation more likely. The fire company he helped establish operated on a mutual aid principle. Members contributed equipment and committed to respond to each other's emergencies. It was a designed system for distributing risk across a community, which is exactly what insurance is, and Franklin understood it in those terms. The improvements to the night watch followed a similar logic. The existing arrangement was underfunded and structurally misaligned, with costs falling on people regardless of their property holdings, and therefore without the incentive structure that would motivate careful stewardship. Franklin proposed a reformed system in which contributions were proportional to property value, aligning the interests of those who paid with the interests of those who needed protection. These were not dramatic interventions. They were the application of clear thinking to practical problems, producing solutions that were better than what they replaced. This is unglamorous work, and and it is precisely the kind of work that disappears from biographical accounts in favour of more visually compelling episodes. But it was the work that made Philadelphia function better as a city. And it was the work that built, brick by brick, the reputation that would eventually carry Franklin far beyond Philadelphia's boundaries. There is a version of the kite experiment that most people carry in their heads: a man in a field, a kite, a key on a string, a thunderstorm. Lightning strikes, the key sparks, electricity is proven to be the same force as lightning. Franklin becomes famous. The version is not wrong in its broad outlines, but it compresses into a single dramatic image something that was actually a decade of methodical, unglamorous scientific work, and it obscures almost entirely what Franklin was actually risking when he stood in that field. The electrical work began in earnest around 1745, when a glass tube and instructions for replicating recent European experiments arrived in Philadelphia, sent to the Library Company by a London correspondent named Peter Collinson. The experiments that had been circulating among European natural philosophers in the early 1740s were genuinely astonishing in their visual drama, large apparatus generating visible sparks. Small birds killed by electrical discharge, spirits set on fire. They had excited the curiosity of scientists across the continent and produced a considerable volume of competing theories about what electricity actually was and how it behaved. Franklin engaged with these experiments with the full intensity he brought to every intellectual problem he decided was worth his attention. He gathered a small group of friends and they worked through the existing experiments systematically, then began designing their own. What distinguished Franklin's approach from many of his contemporaries was the same quality that distinguished his approach to everything else. He was less interested in producing impressive phenomena than in understanding the underlying structure that produced them. The sparks and the killed birds were data. He wanted to know what the data meant. His first significant contribution was the identification of what he called the plus and minus state of electricity, what we would now call positive and negative charge. The observation that electrical phenomena involved not the creation of new electrical matter, but the redistribution of existing electrical matter between objects was a genuinely novel theoretical insight. It reframed the entire field. Before Franklin, electricity was understood primarily as something produced by friction, generated, in the language of the time, from nothing. Franklin's reconceptualization suggested instead that electricity was a single fluid that existed in everything, and that experimental manipulations were moving it from one place to another rather than creating or destroying it. This theoretical shift had immediate practical consequences for understanding the Leyden jar, a device that stored electrical charge and that had puzzled natural philosophers because its behaviour seemed to contradict prevailing theories about where the charge was located. Franklin's framework explained the jar's behaviour simply and elegantly, predicting experimental results that other theories could not account for. He communicated these findings to Collinson in a series of letters beginning in 1747, describing experiments and theoretical conclusions with the same plain, precise language he brought to everything he wrote. Collinson submitted the letters to the Royal Society of London. They were declined. The Society's gatekeepers looked at these communications from a colonial printer with no formal scientific credentials and concluded they were not worth the transaction's pages. This was not the first time an institution had decided Franklin was not the right kind of person to be taken seriously, and it was not the last. It was, however, the one that history has treated most unkindly toward the institution, because the letters Collinson then arranged to have published independently became among the most widely read scientific documents of the 18th century. The kite experiment itself, conducted in the summer of 1752, was the culmination of a theoretical program Franklin had been developing for 3 years. He had proposed as early as 1749 that lightning and electrical discharge were the same phenomenon, and had outlined a method for testing this by erecting a pointed iron rod on an elevated structure and observing whether it drew electrical matter from passing clouds. Philadelphia had no suitable elevated structure available while he was waiting, and the experiment did not get run. While waiting, he realised that a kite could reach the altitude he needed without requiring any fixed structure at all. He went out with his son William on a day when a thunderstorm was approaching. He told no one else. The reason he gave for this secrecy is worth sitting with. He did not want to expose himself to public ridicule if the experiment failed. A man who had spent his entire adult life carefully managing his reputation, who had wheeled paper through the streets in plain clothes and published his ideas under pen names, and introduced civic improvements through intermediaries, understood exactly what a failed public experiment would cost. He ran it privately first. The kite went up. For a period, nothing happened. The storm passed overhead. Franklin was close to concluding the attempt had failed when he noticed the loose fibres of the hemp string beginning to stand erect. He brought his knuckle to the key attached to the string, where the hemp met the silk lower section. A spark jumped. Then another. He charged a Leyden jar from the key. He ran the full sequence of electrical experiments he had previously performed only in his workshop, now powered by actual lightning drawn from an actual storm. The experiment confirmed what he had theorized. Lightning was electricity. The implications were immediate and practical, because Franklin had already worked out what followed from that conclusion. If lightning was electrical discharge moving between clouds and the earth, then a pointed metal rod connected to the ground could provide a path of lower resistance than the building it protected, drawing the discharge safely away. The lightning rod was not an invention that followed the experiment. It was a design Franklin had already proposed on the basis of theory alone, waiting for the experimental confirmation that would make the proposal credible to people who required it. The lightning rod spread rapidly. Buildings fitted with pointed iron rods connected to the earth experienced dramatically fewer fire losses from lightning strikes than buildings without them. The device worked in exactly the way Franklin had predicted it would, for exactly the reasons he had identified. It was the most direct possible translation of theoretical understanding into practical benefit, a problem identified, a mechanism understood, a solution designed and deployed. The Royal Society, which had declined his letters 5 years earlier, now made him a fellow. The universities of Edinburgh, Oxford and St Andrews conferred honorary degrees. European scientific societies competed to claim him as a member. The correspondence he received from natural philosophers across the continent multiplied. The same establishment that had assessed him as not worth publishing was now lining up to associate itself with his name. Franklin noted this reversal without extensive comment. He had watched institutions make this kind of adjustment before, in smaller contexts and with smaller stakes. An institution that has misjudged something significant does not announce the misjudgment. It simply begins treating the previously dismissed thing as if the dismissal had never occurred. Franklin understood this as a feature of how institutions behave, rather than a particular moral failure, and he accepted the belated recognition without either false modesty or visible satisfaction at the correction. Scientific recognition and civic standing had given Franklin something he had never previously possessed, a position so established that losing it would constitute an actual fall. For most of his adult life, the only direction available had been upward. There had been nothing beneath him to protect, because he had arrived with nothing worth protecting. By the early 1750s, That had changed entirely. He had a reputation, a business, a family, and a network of relationships that took decades to build. He had, for the first time, something significant to lose. The test came not from a rival or an institution, but from a war. General Edward Braddock arrived in the colonies in 1755 to lead a British military campaign against French-held Fort Duquesne in western Pennsylvania. The campaign required wagons, horses, and provisions, quantities of both that the British military had significantly underestimated and that the colonial countryside around their staging point in Virginia could not supply. Braddock was running out of time and patience when Franklin, attending as a Pennsylvania Assembly representative, assessed the situation and made an offer. He would personally travel through the Pennsylvania countryside and solicit wagons and horses from the farming communities there. He had the relationships and the reputation to make the ask credible. More than that, when the farmers were reluctant, as many were given the military's history of requisitioning property without adequate compensation. Franklin put his own name behind the promise of payment. He personally guaranteed the debts. 150 wagons, hundreds of horses, thousands of pounds of personal liability signed in Franklin's name, secured against nothing but his word and his standing. The campaign was a catastrophe. Braddock was ambushed well short of his objective. The British forces were routed. Braddock himself was mortally wounded. The retreat that followed was chaotic, and in the disorder, the military destroyed much of its own baggage and equipment to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. The farmers who had lent their wagons and horses on Franklin's guarantee began arriving with their demands. The losses were real. The guarantees were legally binding. The liability fell to the man who had signed his name to it. Franklin was facing the potential destruction of everything the previous 25 years had built. The printing house, the properties, the accumulated financial position that represented not inherited wealth, but the compounded product of a lifetime of disciplined work. All of it was exposed to claims he had not anticipated and could not easily cover. The men who came with their demands were not abstractions. They were the same kind of working farmers and tradesmen Franklin had grown up among, people whose wagons represented a significant portion of their productive capacity and who had trusted his name precisely because that name had meant something reliable. Governor Shirley eventually intervened. Recognizing that Franklin had incurred the debts in direct service of the colonial government's military obligations, he arranged for the claims to be settled from public funds rather than from Franklin's personal resources. The catastrophe was averted. Franklin recorded the outcome with the restraint characteristic of a man who has just watched a very large number come very close to destroying him, and has decided that extended commentary would serve no useful purpose. The Braddock episode had demonstrated something about Franklin that went beyond his capacity to survive a financial crisis. It had demonstrated that he could operate effectively in a space where civilian life intersected with military necessity, where political relationships determined practical outcomes, and where a man's personal credibility was the only available currency in a system too chaotic for formal instruments to function. That demonstration did not go unnoticed by the people who needed someone to represent Pennsylvania's interests in a forum far more consequential than a military supply operation. In 1757, the Pennsylvania Assembly appointed Franklin as its agent to Great Britain. The immediate task was specific: negotiate with the Penn family, the proprietors of Pennsylvania, descendants of William Penn, who held governing authority over the province over the long-running dispute about whether their estates could be taxed to fund the colony's defence. The proprietors lived in England. The dispute had been generating heat and obstruction for years without resolution. The Assembly needed someone in London who could argue Pennsylvania's case before the Privy Council with enough skill and standing to be taken seriously by people accustomed to taking colonials seriously only when forced to. Franklin was the obvious choice. He had the intellectual capacity to master a complex legal and political argument. He had the personal relationships built over years of scientific correspondence and Junto-era networking that gave him access to the rooms where decisions were made. He had the reputation, now extending well beyond Philadelphia through his electrical work and the almanac, that made him a figure rather than a supplicant. And he had, by this point in his life, the particular quality that prolonged negotiation requires above almost everything else: patience that did not read as passivity. He sailed in June of 1757. He would not return to Philadelphia for 5 years. The London he arrived in was not the London of his youth. The city of Palmer's Press and Watts's printing house and the intellectual coffee houses where a young colonial tradesman had quietly absorbed everything the most intellectually active city in the world had to offer. He was no longer a young tradesman. He was a man of 51, famous in circles that had previously been entirely closed to him, arriving not to find work, but to conduct business on behalf of a colonial government with legitimate grievances against powerful opponents. The Penn family received him with a cold civility that powerful people extend to opponents they have not yet decided how to neutralize. Thomas Penn and Richard Penn had inherited their father's province along with their father's complicated legacy. The original charter of Pennsylvania had been granted to William Penn on terms that the current proprietors interpreted in ways that maximized their own authority and minimized their financial obligations to the colony they nominally governed. They were not unreasonable men in every respect. They were men whose financial interests were directly threatened by the Assembly's position, and they conducted themselves accordingly. The negotiations proceeded with the grinding slowness characteristic of disputes where both parties have legitimate legal arguments and neither has sufficient leverage to force a resolution. Franklin argued Pennsylvania's case before the Privy Council with a thoroughness that impressed even observers who were not sympathetic to the colonial position. The proprietors pushed back through their own advocates. Months passed. The specific point in dispute, whether the proprietary estates were subject to the same taxation as other landholdings in Pennsylvania, was eventually resolved through a compromise in which Franklin personally guaranteed that any tax assessment would be applied equitably, without using the new provisions to disproportionately burden the Penn family's holdings. The Penns accepted this guarantee. The fact that they accepted it, that they were willing to allow a resolution to rest on Franklin's personal word rather than on any legal enforcement mechanism, was itself a statement about what his reputation had become. These were not men who trusted easily or cheaply. They trusted Franklin's guarantee because they had concluded, through whatever process powerful men use to assess the reliability of their opponents, that it would be honoured. They were correct. The assessment Franklin had made of himself in his earliest journals, that truth and probity in transactions between people were the actual foundations of a functional life, had produced, over 30 years of consistent practice, a credibility that even hostile parties could not discount. The immediate business concluded, Franklin remained in London. The Assembly found further uses for him. The colonies of Massachusetts, Maryland, and Georgia each appointed him as their agent, recognizing that having the most famous American in Europe working their interests in London was an advantage too significant to leave unexploited. He became, without any formal appointment to the role, the de facto representative of colonial interests in the British capital at the precise moment when those interests were beginning to diverge from British policy in ways that would eventually become irreconcilable. His life in London during these years had a texture entirely unlike his previous residence there. He lived comfortably, moved in the best scientific and intellectual circles, corresponded with natural philosophers across Europe, and continued the electrical work alongside a growing range of other scientific interests. He was awarded honorary degrees by the University of St Andrews and later by Oxford and Edinburgh. The Royal Society, which had declined his letters a decade earlier, treated him as one of its most distinguished fellows. European scientific societies sent him membership certificates. He was, in the world of natural philosophy, no longer a colonial curiosity, but a figure of genuine international standing. This standing gave him access that a purely political representative would not have had. He moved between scientific gatherings and parliamentary antechambers with a fluency that made him genuinely useful in both directions. He could explain colonial conditions to British intellectuals who had genuine curiosity about America and no reliable information about it, and he could carry back to the colonial assemblies an understanding of British political culture that most colonials could only guess at from a distance. He was a translator, in the broadest sense, not between languages but between worlds that were beginning to misunderstand each other in ways that carried serious consequences. He also found in London something he had not anticipated finding, a life that suited him in ways that Philadelphia, for all that he had built there, did not entirely match. The density of intellectual exchange, the proximity to the institutions where European science was being made, the access to conversations with people whose range of knowledge and experience extended far beyond anything a colonial city could concentrate, all of it engaged him in a way that he did not disguise, even when the engagement complicated his relationship with a wife and family who remained in Philadelphia and whom he saw rarely over the course of a decade. Deborah Franklin did not travel to London. She had an established fear of ocean voyages that she never overcame, and Franklin did not press the point. Their marriage was sustained across the Atlantic by correspondence that was affectionate in tone but thin in frequency, and by the practical management of household affairs that Deborah handled in Philadelphia with the same competence she had always brought to everything. The distance was real. Franklin acknowledged it without extended self-examination. He was in London because Pennsylvania needed him there, and because London offered him a form of intellectual life that he valued in ways he was not always careful to conceal. The political situation was changing around him in ways that made his position increasingly complicated. The tensions between British imperial policy and colonial interests were not yet a crisis when he arrived in 1757, but they were moving steadily in that direction. The question of taxation, who had the right to impose it on whom, under what authority, and with what colonial consent, was not merely the specific dispute he had been sent to resolve with the Penn family. It was the foundational question of the entire imperial relationship, and it was becoming impossible to address in any particular case without engaging the general principle. There is a moment in the life of any structure, a bridge, a building, an argument, where the separate elements that have been developing in parallel finally meet at a single point and either hold or give way. Franklin had been running two parallel developments for decades without fully acknowledging that they were headed toward the same place. One was external, the steady accumulation of position, reputation, and institutional standing built against the resistance of every system that had initially tried to contain or dismiss him. The other was internal, the ongoing, imperfect, honestly documented project of becoming a person whose conduct matched his stated values closely enough to be worth the effort. London had brought both threads to their most demanding test simultaneously. The political situation that Franklin had spent years trying to navigate through argument and relationship had by the early 1760s begun to harden into something that patient advocacy could not soften. British parliamentary decisions about colonial taxation were not the product of malice toward America. They were the product of an imperial administration that genuinely could not conceive of a relationship between a governing centre and its colonial territories in which the territories had meaningful input into the terms of their own governance. The framework itself was the problem, not the specific people operating within it. Franklin understood this intellectually before he accepted it practically, because accepting it practically meant conceding that the reform he had been working toward was not achievable within the existing structure. He had spent the better part of a decade arguing that the empire could be made fair. He had made the argument with every instrument available to him: personal relationships, published pamphlets, testimony before parliamentary committees, private correspondence with ministers and members of parliament who showed signs of genuine curiosity about colonial conditions. He had been persuasive enough in specific instances to produce specific results. The Penn family dispute had been resolved. Particular pieces of legislation had been modified or repealed in response to arguments he had helped assemble and deliver, but each specific victory existed inside a framework that was steadily moving in the opposite direction at the structural level. Winning an argument about a particular tax did not change the assumption that Parliament had the authority to impose that tax without colonial consent. Modifying a specific piece of legislation did not alter the underlying relationship between a Parliament in which colonials had no representation and a colonial population that was increasingly unwilling to accept decisions made entirely without their input. Franklin arrived at his revised understanding of this situation through the same process he applied to every other question: observation, evidence, and the willingness to change a position when the evidence required it. He had held his reformist position honestly, argued it in good faith, and tested it against the available evidence for as long as the evidence could support it. When the evidence stopped supporting it, he updated his view. This was not a dramatic conversion. It was an incremental adjustment of the kind he had been making throughout his life, each error recognised, recorded, and incorporated into a revised understanding of what was actually true. The obstacles that had shaped his life from the beginning now appeared in their largest and most consequential form. The world that had tried to stop him had operated in his early years. At the scale of a Boston printing house, a broken apprenticeship contract, a colonial governor's empty promises. It had operated at the scale of a damaged press in Philadelphia, a bankrupt competitor, an institutional gatekeeper in London who declined to publish letters that would eventually reshape electrical science. Each of these obstacles had been navigated, circumvented, or outlasted. Each had contributed something to the construction of the person who faced the next one. The obstacle he now faced operated at the scale of an empire, and the system builder, who had spent 50 years converting constraints into designs, was beginning to understand that some constraints cannot be converted, they can only be replaced. What Franklin carried into this recognition was everything the two threads had produced between them. The external thread had given him standing in colonial assemblies, in British scientific circles, in the rooms where European power was exercised, and where a man from a Boston candlemaker's household had no natural right to be present, and was present anyway, because he had built himself into someone those rooms could not afford to ignore. The internal thread had given him something less visible but equally necessary, a record of honest self-assessment so consistent and so well maintained that he knew with unusual precision what he was capable of and what he was not, where his judgment was reliable and where it required supplementing. The incomplete sentence at the end of the previous chapter was not an accident of composition. It was a documentary record doing what Franklin's own autobiography eventually did, stopping before the ending was fully written, because the person at the centre of the story had not finished becoming who he was going to be. Franklin left his autobiography incomplete. The man who had designed systems for everything, who had maintained a virtue notebook for decades, who had written down his errors with a precision that most people reserve for their achievements, that man left his own life story without a final chapter. It is the most honest thing he ever did. But the verdict the documentary has been moving toward is not biographical in the narrow sense. It is not about what happened to Franklin after the threads converged. It is about what the convergence itself reveals, about him, and about the broader question his life poses to anyone willing to take it seriously. The question is this: what does it actually mean to build yourself from nothing? The answer Franklin's life offers is more complicated than the version that has circulated since Poor Richard first told 10,000 colonial readers that early rising and hard work were the reliable path from poverty to prosperity. That version is not false. Franklin did rise from poverty through disciplined work, and it did produce prosperity. But it is a partial account of a much more intricate process, and the parts it leaves out are precisely the parts that reveal what was actually happening. Franklin was not a self-made man in the sense that mythology uses the term a lone individual whose exceptional qualities lifted him above his circumstances through sheer personal force. The mythology requires isolation, a single hero operating against an indifferent or hostile world, succeeding through qualities no one else possessed. This version of the story is emotionally satisfying and analytically useless. It explains nothing about how the outcome was actually produced. What Franklin built was not primarily himself. He built systems. The Junto was a system. The library was a system. The Virtues Notebook was a system. The Almanac was a system for delivering practical wisdom to people who needed it in a form they could use. The printing house was a system for converting skill and discipline into commercial position. The lightning rod was a system for converting theoretical understanding into practical protection. The persona of Poor Richard was a system for reaching an audience that a more authoritative voice would have failed to reach. Even the management of his own public appearance, the plain clothes, the wheelbarrow, the deliberate avoidance of conspicuous amusement, was a system for building a specific kind of reputation in a community where reputation was collateral. Every obstacle he encountered became, in his hands, a design problem. The absence of formal education became a self-directed reading program more rigorous than most formal educations. The absence of capital became an occasion for building the kind of reputation that substituted for capital in credit relationships. The absence of institutional standing became a reason to build institutions. The absence of a patron became a reason to develop the independence that made patrons unnecessary. The world that tried to stop him did not produce his success, but it produced the specific shape of what he built, because every system he designed was a response to a specific constraint that the world had placed in his path. This is what distinguishes Franklin from the myth of the self-made man. The myth celebrates the individual who overcomes obstacles. Franklin's actual story is about a person who converted obstacles into structural improvements, who looked at what was missing and built it, not just for himself, but for whoever came after him. The library was open to everyone who could pay 10 shillings a year. The fire company protected the whole neighbourhood, not just the members. The civic improvements he engineered through the Junto made Philadelphia function better as a city for people who had never heard of Benjamin Franklin and would never know his name. The lightning rod was published without a patent, freely available to anyone who wanted to build one. This generative quality. The compulsion to build things that outlasted their builder and served people beyond the builder's immediate circle is not what the mythology of self-making typically emphasizes. The mythology is about personal advancement. What Franklin actually practiced was something closer to what he had observed in his father's household. A man of no particular standing who made himself useful to his community in ways that extended well beyond the requirements of his trade, and who derived genuine satisfaction from the quality of the work rather than exclusively from its rewards. The contradictions deserve acknowledgement because Franklin maintained them honestly, and they are part of the record. He preached frugality while living comfortably in London for nearly 2 decades. He wrote about virtue while acknowledging that his own performance against the 13 standards was permanently imperfect. He published maxims about the reliable relationship between industry and advancement in a society where that relationship was available only to people whose circumstances matched his own. He was a system builder who understood that his systems were partial, that they described and served a portion of the world while leaving other portions outside the frame. He did not resolve these contradictions. He recorded them and continued. This is either a moral failing or a realistic assessment of what any person can achieve within a single lifetime, and the line between those two interpretations is not as clear as either his admirers or his critics have typically suggested. What is clear is that he did not pretend the contradictions away. The same habit of honest accounting that he had applied to his errors from the age of 17 continued operating into old age, producing a record that is more self-aware than almost anything produced by a public figure of his era. The autobiography he left incomplete was, in a sense, the final system. He designed it as a letter to his son, a transmission of the specific, tested knowledge he had accumulated about how a life could be built from nothing, and he populated it with the same combination of practical instruction and honest self-assessment that had characterized every other system he built. It was not a monument, it was a tool intended to be used. He wrote, near the beginning of that unfinished document, that if he were offered the chance to live his life again from the start, he would accept. He would ask only for an author's privilege to correct, in a second edition, certain errors of the first. The errors he had in mind were specific. He had listed most of them over the course of the document: the broken indenture, the silence toward Miss Reed, the pamphlet, the credulity that sent him to London on a governor's false promise, the behaviour toward Mrs. T, the miscalculation about British reform. He knew what they were. He had been keeping the list since he was 17 years old.